The streets of South Boston have always carried a certain quiet weight after midnight. Long after the bars close and the last footsteps echo down narrow sidewalks, the neighborhood settles into a hush that feels heavier than silence itself. Streetlights glow softly against brick buildings, illuminating doorways that have witnessed generations of lives passing through them. To an outsider, it appears calm, almost peaceful. But for decades, beneath that stillness, there was an understanding shared by everyone who lived there, an unspoken awareness that someone was always watching, always listening, always in control. His name was James Whitey Bulger, and for years, he did not need to announce himself. He existed in whispers, in glances exchanged a second too long, in conversations that stopped abruptly when a stranger entered the room. Parents warned their children without ever explaining why. Shop owners paid what they were told to pay. Men who crossed certain invisible lines simply vanished, leaving behind questions that no one dared to ask out loud. Fear did not arrive suddenly in South Boston, it seeped in slowly, until it felt normal, almost routine. What makes Whitey Bulger's story linger is not just the violence associated with his name, but the way power wrapped itself around him so quietly. He was not flashy. He did not seek the spotlight. Unlike other infamous gangsters who craved headlines and public admiration, Bulger understood something far more effective: true control operates best when it remains unseen. The less people talked, the longer he stayed untouchable. And for a very long time, that strategy worked. To understand how one man came to dominate an entire city's underworld, it helps to imagine Boston not as a modern metropolis, but as a collection of tightly bound neighborhoods, each with its own history, loyalties, and grudges. South Boston, in particular, was a place defined by pride and survival. Families lived close together, shared hardships, and remembered every slight. Respect mattered. Reputation mattered even more. In such an environment, strength was not measured by money alone, but by the ability to command silence. Whitey Bulger mastered that art. By the time his name became known across the country, he had already spent decades shaping the criminal landscape of Boston. Law enforcement chased rumors. Journalists chased fragments of truth. Rivals learned, often too late, that crossing him came with consequences that extended far beyond the individual. Yet what shocked the public most was not simply that Bulger was a violent crime boss, but that he managed to operate with protection from the very institutions meant to stop him. This is where his story shifts from familiar gangster narrative into something darker and more unsettling. For years, while bodies accumulated and families searched for answers, Bulger maintained a secret relationship with the FBI. He was officially labeled an informant, a source of information on rival criminal organizations. Unofficially, this relationship granted him a shield, one that allowed him to eliminate competition, expand his influence, and avoid prosecution time and time again. To those living in South Boston, the effects were immediate and personal. There was no need to understand federal corruption or internal investigations. All that mattered was that Whitey Bulger seemed immune. Police raids happened elsewhere. Arrests happened to other people. His presence remained constant, like an unmovable fixture in the neighborhood. Over time, fear evolved into resignation. And resignation evolved into acceptance. But even the most carefully maintained illusions eventually crack. At the height of his power, Bulger controlled drug trafficking, extortion, loan sharking, and gambling operations throughout the city. He decided who profited and who disappeared. Loyalty was rewarded. Betrayal was not forgiven. Those who worked with him often described an unsettling calm about the way he operated, decisions made without emotion, punishments delivered without hesitation. Violence, to Bulger, was not an act of rage. It was a tool. Precise. Purposeful. Final. Yet while his criminal empire expanded, another narrative unfolded quietly in parallel. Above ground, Boston functioned like any other American city. Children went to school. City officials gave speeches. Neighborhoods celebrated holidays and mourned losses. And somewhere within that structure, the lines between legality and criminality blurred in ways most people never imagined. Whitey Bulger was not just hiding from the system, he was entangled with it. That contradiction sits at the heart of his story. How does someone become both predator and protected asset? How does a man responsible for so much suffering manage to live openly for years, attending neighborhood events, walking familiar streets, blending into daily life? And perhaps most disturbingly, how many people suspected the truth but chose silence instead? As you listen to this story unfold, it is important to set aside the image of a single villain operating alone. Whitey Bulger's rise was not just the result of personal ambition or cruelty. It was enabled by systems that failed, by institutions that prioritized convenience over justice, and by a culture of fear that discouraged resistance. He did not create corruption, but he learned how to live inside it. The calm tone of this story does not soften its reality. Instead, it mirrors the way Bulger himself moved through the world, quietly, deliberately, without unnecessary noise. His life was not a series of explosive moments, but a long, slow accumulation of power. Each decision built upon the last, creating a structure that seemed, for a time, unbreakable. And yet, beneath the control and confidence, there was always something fragile about it all. Power rooted in secrecy cannot survive exposure forever. Loyalty enforced through fear eventually turns inward. The same silence that protected Bulger would one day isolate him. The same systems that shielded him would begin to fracture under scrutiny. But that reckoning was still far away. For now, imagine South Boston as it once was, dimly lit streets, familiar faces, and a sense that certain names should never be spoken too loudly. Imagine a man who understood that fear works best when it feels inevitable. And imagine a city that, knowingly or not, lived under the influence of someone who controlled not just crime, but quiet. What happened next would not only reshape Boston's underworld, but expose one of the most disturbing alliances in American criminal history, an alliance that allowed one man to rule from the shadows, untouched, while the consequences rippled outward for decades to come. South Boston in the late 1930s and 1940s was not a place of grand dreams or easy escapes. It was a neighborhood shaped by economic struggle, where families lived close together not by choice, but by necessity. Brick housing projects stood as symbols of endurance rather than opportunity, and for many children growing up there, life followed a narrow path laid out by circumstance. It was into this world that James Joseph Bulger was born, surrounded by the quiet pressures of poverty and the unspoken expectation that survival came before ambition. The Bulger family lived in the old Harbor Village housing project, a tight cluster of buildings near the water. The ocean breeze carried both comfort and cold, a constant reminder of the working-class lives tied to docks, factories, and long hours of physical labor. His father, James Sr., worked as a union laborer, a job that demanded strength and offered little security. When illness took that stability away, the family's financial footing collapsed almost overnight. The sudden loss of income forced everyone to adapt quickly, reinforcing a lesson young Whitey absorbed early: stability was fragile, and no one was coming to save you. In South Boston, community bonds ran deep, but they came with expectations. Loyalty was valued above nearly everything else. You looked out for your own, you didn't complain, and you certainly didn't talk to outsiders about internal matters. This culture of silence wasn't born from criminal intent, it was born from generations of hardship. When resources were scarce and authority figures felt distant or indifferent, people relied on each other. That reliance gradually hardened into a code. Whitey Bulger grew up watching how respect functioned in this environment. It wasn't granted freely. It was earned through toughness, reliability, and an ability to stand your ground. Weakness, whether emotional or physical, invited exploitation. From an early age, he learned how quickly a reputation could shape a person's fate. A single rumor could follow you for years. A single act of defiance could elevate your standing or destroy it completely. School offered little refuge. Classrooms were overcrowded, underfunded, and often secondary to the realities waiting outside their doors. For many boys, education felt abstract compared to the immediate lessons taught on the streets, lessons about dominance, territory, and belonging. Whitey was not particularly distinguished as a student, but he was observant. He watched how authority figures spoke, how they disciplined, and how often they were ignored once their backs were turned. These observations quietly reinforced a growing skepticism toward institutional power. Religion played a visible role in neighborhood life. Catholic churches served as anchors, offering structure and ritual amid uncertainty. Families attended Mass, children learned prayers, and moral language filled conversations. But alongside these teachings existed a practical morality shaped by survival. Right and wrong were not always clear-cut. Loyalty to family and neighborhood often outweighed abstract rules. This duality, public morality paired with private pragmatism, left a deep imprint on Whitey's developing worldview. At home, discipline was firm but unremarkable for the time. Expectations were clear, resources limited, and emotions rarely discussed. The Bulger household, like many others in South Boston, focused on endurance rather than expression. Hardship was something you carried quietly. Complaints were signs of weakness. This emotional restraint would later become one of Whitey Bulger's defining traits, the ability to compartmentalize, to separate action from feeling. Among his siblings, one relationship stood out in contrast to the rest of his life, his bond with his younger brother, William, known later as Billy. While Whitey gravitated toward the streets, Billy showed an early inclination toward structure and legitimacy. Teachers noticed his aptitude. He followed rules more closely, navigated authority with ease, and imagined a future within the system rather than outside it. At the time, the difference may have seemed minor. In hindsight, it symbolized a fork in the road, two brothers shaped by the same environment, choosing radically different paths. As Whitey entered adolescence, the pull of the streets grew stronger. Gangs were not romanticized organizations but loose collections of boys seeking identity and protection. Membership offered status, excitement, and a sense of control otherwise missing from daily life. These groups enforced their own rules, often more strictly than any adult authority. Fighting, stealing, and proving oneself were rites of passage rather than crimes in the eyes of peers. Whitey adapted quickly. He was not the loudest or the most reckless, but he learned how to project confidence. He understood when to speak and when to stay silent. He noticed that fear was not always created through violence, it could be cultivated through consistency and reputation. If people believed you were capable of crossing a line, you rarely had to prove it. The streets of South Boston became his classroom. Every interaction offered information: who backed down, who pushed forward, who held grudges, who forgot. These details mattered. They formed an internal map of power relationships that Whitey carried with him long after childhood. While others reacted emotionally to conflicts, he began to approach them strategically. This environment also fostered a deep distrust of outsiders, particularly law enforcement. Police were seen less as protectors and more as temporary obstacles, figures who came and went, enforcing rules that felt disconnected from neighborhood realities. Arrests were common, but accountability felt inconsistent. Some people were targeted repeatedly, while others seemed untouched. Even as a teenager, Whitey noticed these disparities, planting early seeds of cynicism. Yet it would be inaccurate to paint his early life as entirely dark or devoid of normalcy. There were moments of camaraderie, laughter, and shared experience. Neighborhood games, summer days by the water, and small celebrations offered brief relief from hardship. But these moments existed alongside a constant awareness of scarcity. Nothing lasted forever. Trust had limits. Security was temporary. As he moved closer to adulthood, the foundation of his mindset was already set. The world, as he understood it, rewarded strength and punished hesitation. Authority was negotiable. Loyalty was transactional. Silence was survival. These beliefs did not make him a criminal overnight, but they prepared him for one. They stripped away illusions and replaced them with calculation. What makes this period of Whitey Bulger's life so important is not the crimes that followed, but the logic that preceded them. His later actions did not emerge from chaos, they emerged from a consistent internal framework shaped by environment, observation, and necessity. South Boston did not create a monster, but it did produce someone uniquely equipped to navigate a world where power thrived in the shadows. As the years passed and opportunities for legitimate advancement narrowed, the pull of risk grew stronger. The streets had already taught him the rules. Soon, he would begin testing how far those rules could bend before they broke. And in doing so, he would step onto a path that led far beyond the neighborhood that raised him, carrying its values, its silences, and its contradictions with him every step of the way. By the time James Whitey Bulger reached his late teens, the rhythms of South Boston had become deeply familiar to him. He knew which streets felt safe at night and which ones demanded caution. He understood the subtle signals that passed between people, the brief nods, the pauses in conversation, the unspoken acknowledgments of hierarchy. Childhood had quietly given way to something harder and more defined. The world was no longer about endurance alone, it was about positioning. Small crimes came first, not as acts of rebellion, but as tests. Shoplifting, petty theft, and street-level hustling offered quick rewards and immediate feedback. Success brought confidence. Failure brought consequences. Each encounter refined Whitey's understanding of risk and control. Unlike others who chased adrenaline, he approached these moments with calculation. He paid attention to timing, to witnesses, to patterns. He learned when to move and when to wait. The streets rewarded this patience. While some of his peers were arrested repeatedly for reckless behavior, Whitey managed to stay one step ahead, at least for a while. He was not invisible, but he was careful. That care created a reputation, not as someone unpredictable, but as someone capable. In neighborhoods where survival depended on perception, that distinction mattered. Yet avoidance of trouble was never absolute. Encounters with law enforcement became inevitable, and when they came, they carried weight. Being questioned, searched, or detained reinforced his belief that authority was less about justice and more about leverage. The rules seemed flexible, applied differently depending on who you were and who you knew. These experiences did not inspire fear so much as resentment. Each interaction added another layer to his distrust. As Whitey drifted deeper into street life, he encountered older figures who embodied a different kind of power. These were men who did not rush, who spoke sparingly, and who seemed to operate above the chaos. They controlled territory without drawing attention. They settled disputes with a word rather than a fight. To a young man searching for structure and respect, these figures represented something more enduring than fleeting street credibility. He watched them closely. He noted how they carried themselves, how others deferred to them without question. This was not authority imposed, it was authority accepted. Whitey began to understand that violence was only one component of control, and often not the most effective one. The real influence came from consistency, reputation, and the ability to reward loyalty while punishing betrayal decisively. These lessons unfolded gradually, almost imperceptibly. There was no single moment where Whitey decided to become something more dangerous. Instead, each choice narrowed his options. Each successful theft made the next one easier. Each avoided consequence reinforced the belief that he could manage risk better than others. Over time, the line between necessity and ambition blurred. Friendships during this period were fluid and conditional. Loyalty existed, but it was tested constantly. Whitey learned that trust, once broken, could rarely be repaired. He also learned that betrayal often came from desperation rather than malice. People talked when pressure mounted. They confessed when cornered. This awareness would later shape his ruthless approach to informants and perceived threats. His growing involvement in crime brought him into contact with broader networks beyond South Boston. These connections introduced him to organized operations, robberies planned rather than improvised, profits divided systematically, and roles assigned based on ability rather than impulse. For the first time, crime appeared not just as survival, but as structure. Yet with structure came scrutiny. Arrests during this period became more serious, and consequences heavier. Whitey was eventually caught and convicted for a series of crimes that escalated beyond petty theft. The transition from street hustler to convicted criminal marked a turning point. It forced him to confront the reality of incarceration, not as an abstract threat, but as an imminent experience. Facing prison altered his perspective. Fear existed, but it was tempered by curiosity. He wondered how power functioned behind bars, how hierarchy reformed itself in confined spaces. Even before entering, he anticipated that prison, like the streets, would operate on its own logic. This mindset allowed him to approach confinement not as defeat, but as another environment to study. The early days of incarceration were disorienting. Freedom vanished abruptly, replaced by routine and surveillance. Every movement was observed. Every interaction carried implications. For many, this environment crushed spirit and ambition. For Whitey, it sharpened focus. He watched how inmates formed alliances, how guards exercised discretion, and how unofficial systems emerged alongside formal rules. Violence in prison was unpredictable but patterned. Certain behaviors invited conflict, others discouraged it. Whitey learned quickly where to stand, when to speak, and how to avoid unnecessary attention. He recognized that reputation traveled faster inside than outside. A single act could define your standing for years. Patience, once again, proved essential. These experiences reinforced his belief that systems were never as rigid as they appeared. Rules existed, but enforcement varied. Influence could be cultivated. Information had value. The seeds of his later manipulations were planted here, long before the FBI ever entered his story. Importantly, prison also deepened his emotional detachment. Survival required compartmentalization. Regret was unproductive. Vulnerability was dangerous. Whitey learned to separate action from feeling, consequence from emotion. This psychological shift would later enable acts that others found unbearable. When he eventually returned to the outside world, he did not emerge as a reformed man. He emerged as a refined one. Prison had not broken him, it had educated him. The streets he returned to were familiar, but he was no longer the same person who had left them. He carried with him a clearer understanding of power, loyalty, and the limits of trust. This phase of his life marks the transition from potential to inevitability. The choices he made were no longer reactive, they were intentional. The path ahead narrowed, guided by lessons learned through hardship rather than idealism. What lay ahead was not chaos, but calculation. As Whitey stepped back into South Boston, he did so with a quieter confidence. He had seen what happened when systems failed individuals. He had learned how to navigate confinement without losing control. And he had realized something crucial: the world rewarded those who understood its rules well enough to bend them. What he would become next was not yet fully formed, but the foundation was solid. The boy shaped by poverty had become a man shaped by experience. And the streets, once his proving ground, were about to become something else entirely, a stage upon which patience, fear, and power would converge in ways that few could have imagined. Prison did not arrive in Whitey Bulger's life as a sudden shock. It arrived as a consequence he had long anticipated, a door he knew would eventually open. Still, knowing something is coming and living inside it are very different experiences. When the gates closed behind him, the world narrowed instantly. The noise of the streets was replaced by the constant hum of confinement, metal doors, echoing footsteps, voices carried through concrete corridors. Time slowed, stretched, and reshaped itself. Incarceration stripped away the illusions that even seasoned street criminals sometimes carried. Inside, reputation mattered, but it had to be proven anew. Past stories meant little unless they translated into present behavior. Whitey quickly understood that prison was its own ecosystem, governed by rules that were rarely written but strictly enforced. Strength alone was not enough. Survival required awareness, discipline, and restraint. He was transferred through several facilities, including some of the most notorious federal prisons in the country. Each place carried its own rhythm and dangers. In maximum security environments, tension was constant but often quiet, simmering beneath routine. Violence erupted suddenly, usually without warning, and often over matters that seemed insignificant to outsiders. To those inside, these moments were inevitable outcomes of compressed lives and limited control. Whitey adapted by observing first and acting second. He watched how inmates formed alliances based on race, geography, or shared history. He noted how some men survived by projecting aggression, while others relied on invisibility. He chose a different approach, controlled presence. He did not seek dominance through frequent confrontation, nor did he withdraw entirely. Instead, he positioned himself as someone not to be tested casually. Prison reinforced a lesson he had already begun to learn on the streets: fear could be cultivated without constant violence. A reputation for decisiveness mattered more than a reputation for chaos. When conflicts arose, Whitey learned to end them quickly and conclusively, ensuring they did not repeat. This approach reduced long-term risk and conserved energy, both essential commodities in confinement. Daily life inside followed strict routines. Wake-up calls, head counts, meals, work assignments, each day mirrored the last. For many inmates, this monotony eroded identity and ambition. For Whitey, it created space for reflection. He paid attention to patterns, which guards enforced rules rigidly, which exercised discretion, which could be influenced, and which should never be approached. Authority, he observed, was rarely absolute. Even behind bars, it was negotiated moment by moment. One of the most consequential chapters of his prison years unfolded quietly, under the guise of scientific research. While incarcerated at a federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Whitey volunteered for a government-funded program that he was told involved research into schizophrenia. Like many inmates, he saw participation as a way to break routine, earn small privileges, or shorten the psychological weight of endless days. What he did not fully understand at the time was that he had become part of a covert CIA program later known as MKUltra. Without informed consent, inmates were administered LSD and other substances as part of experiments exploring mind control and psychological manipulation. The sessions were disorienting, unpredictable, and deeply unsettling. Participants were observed as their perceptions fractured, emotions intensified, and sense of reality blurred. For Whitey, the experience left a lasting impression. He later described feelings of paranoia, confusion, and lingering psychological disturbance. Whether these experiments fundamentally altered his personality remains debated, but what is clear is that they deepened his distrust of authority. The government, he believed, was capable of profound deception when it suited its interests. This belief would later influence how he interacted with federal agents, not with reverence, but with calculated skepticism. Rather than emerging from these experiences broken, Whitey compartmentalized them. He learned to lock away discomfort and continue functioning. Emotional suppression became not just a coping mechanism, but a skill. In prison, vulnerability invited exploitation. Detachment offered protection. Over time, this emotional distance hardened into something permanent. His time in some of America's harshest prisons, including Alcatraz, further reinforced his adaptability. Alcatraz was designed not to rehabilitate, but to isolate. Inmates were confined for long hours, denied contact, and subjected to strict discipline. The environment tested patience more than strength. For many, it induced despair. For Whitey, it reinforced endurance. Isolation forced introspection. With distractions stripped away, thoughts became sharper and more focused. He replayed past decisions, not with regret, but analysis. What worked? What failed? Who could be trusted? Who could not? Prison became less a punishment and more a prolonged strategic retreat, a time to refine his understanding of human behavior. Importantly, prison also exposed him to men with deeper connections to organized crime. Conversations carried knowledge that could not be learned elsewhere, about networks, hierarchies, and long-standing feuds. These exchanges expanded his understanding beyond neighborhood-level crime. He began to see how larger systems operated, how alliances shifted, and how information flowed across regions. Information, he realized, was currency. Knowing who was connected to whom, who owed favors, who harbored grudges, these details held value far beyond immediate survival. This realization planted the earliest seeds of a tactic that would later define his life, the strategic use of information to gain leverage. When Whitey eventually earned his release, he did not leave prison carrying hope of reform. He left carrying tools. Prison had educated him in ways the streets never could. It taught him how institutions functioned under pressure, how authority could be manipulated, and how fear could be sustained quietly over time. He returned to the outside world older, more controlled, and far less impulsive. The anger of youth had cooled into calculation. Where others saw prison as lost time, Whitey saw it as preparation. He had learned how to endure isolation, how to command respect without noise, and how to navigate systems designed to control him. Most importantly, he emerged with a hardened belief that loyalty was rare and self-interest universal. This belief would later justify decisions that shocked even those closest to him. In his mind, survival was not about morality, it was about clarity. The man who walked back into Boston was not simply a former inmate. He was someone who had tested himself against some of the most restrictive environments imaginable and adapted. The lessons learned behind bars would echo through every chapter that followed. And while prison doors had opened to let him out, something inside him had closed for good. What awaited him next was not redemption, but opportunity. The streets he once knew were still there, familiar and unchanged. But Whitey Bulger was not. He had learned how to survive confinement, how to manage fear, and how to use silence as a weapon. Soon, those lessons would be applied far beyond prison walls, shaping a reign that would leave a lasting imprint on an entire city. When Whitey Bulger stepped back onto the streets of South Boston after years behind bars, the neighborhood greeted him with a mixture of familiarity and distance. The buildings looked the same, the narrow streets still curved along the waterfront, and the rhythm of daily life continued as it always had. Yet beneath that surface continuity, something had shifted. Time had moved on, alliances had changed, and power had subtly rearranged itself. For Whitey, the challenge was not simply to return, but to reinsert himself without drawing unnecessary attention. He moved carefully at first, reconnecting with old acquaintances and observing more than he spoke. Prison had taught him patience, and he applied it now with precision. He did not announce ambitions or make demands. Instead, he listened. He watched who controlled which corners, who collected money, who had influence and who merely pretended to. In South Boston, reputation traveled quickly, but so did rumors. Whitey was determined not to be underestimated or overexposed. The criminal landscape he returned to was more organized than the one he had left. Independent operators still existed, but larger groups had begun consolidating power. The Winter Hill Gang, operating out of nearby Somerville, had emerged as a dominant force in Boston's underworld. They controlled gambling, loan sharking, and protection rackets across multiple neighborhoods. Unlike the Italian mafia families that operated with rigid hierarchies and formal rules, Winter Hill was fluid, adaptable, and deeply rooted in Irish-American communities. Whitey understood immediately that this environment suited him. Structure existed, but it was informal enough to reward intelligence and discipline. Through mutual contacts and shared history, he began aligning himself with members of the gang. Trust was not given freely, especially to someone with a prison record, but Whitey's demeanor worked in his favor. He was calm, controlled, and seemingly uninterested in reckless displays of power. Slowly, opportunities opened. He took on small roles, proving reliability without drawing attention. Money flowed steadily rather than dramatically. Each successful task reinforced confidence in his abilities. He demonstrated an understanding of the unspoken rules: when to collect, when to wait, when to apply pressure, and when to show restraint. In a world where impulsiveness often led to exposure, his methodical approach stood out. Violence, when it occurred, was deliberate. Whitey avoided unnecessary conflict, but when boundaries were tested, his responses were decisive. Word spread quickly. He was not someone to provoke casually. This reputation grew organically, without theatrics or publicity. People began adjusting their behavior around him, often without conscious realization. This was the foundation of his influence, not fear alone, but predictability. As his standing within the Winter Hill Gang solidified, Whitey began to see how fragmented Boston's criminal networks truly were. Rival groups competed for territory, often undermining one another through informants and internal betrayal. These weaknesses presented opportunity. Whitey recognized that controlling information could be more powerful than controlling muscle. Knowledge of rival operations, disputes, and vulnerabilities became a form of leverage. At the same time, he cultivated a carefully crafted public image. To many in the neighborhood, he appeared as a familiar figure, someone who attended local events, spoke casually with residents, and maintained a sense of belonging. This duality was intentional. By blending into the community, he insulated himself. People were less likely to suspect someone who felt like one of their own. Behind the scenes, however, his influence expanded steadily. He took on greater responsibility within the gang, managing operations and resolving disputes. His decisions were rarely impulsive. Each move was calculated to minimize risk while maximizing control. Loyalty was rewarded with opportunity and protection. Disloyalty, though not immediately punished, was never forgotten. Whitey's understanding of fear evolved during this period. Rather than relying on overt threats, he allowed stories to circulate. People talked among themselves. Reputations grew through implication rather than confirmation. This indirect approach reduced exposure while amplifying impact. Those who understood the message adjusted accordingly. Those who didn't often learned too late. Crucially, Whitey avoided behaviors that attracted law enforcement attention. He delegated tasks, insulated himself from direct involvement, and maintained plausible distance from operations that could draw scrutiny. He learned to let others take visible risks while he remained in the background. This strategy not only protected him legally but reinforced his authority within the hierarchy. His relationship with law enforcement during this period remained cautious. Years of incarceration and the MKUltra experiments had taught him not to trust institutions. He observed how police interacted with different groups, how investigations stalled or accelerated, and how certain individuals seemed immune from scrutiny. These observations would later inform a decision that changed everything, but for now, he remained watchful. As the years passed, Whitey's presence became normalized. He was no longer the man who had returned from prison, he was a fixture. Decisions flowed through him. Conflicts were brought to him for resolution. Money passed through his hands. The Winter Hill Gang's operations grew more stable under his influence, even as they became more ruthless. Yet beneath this outward stability, Whitey carried a constant awareness of fragility. Power, he knew, attracted attention. Attention attracted risk. He balanced expansion with restraint, always conscious that one misstep could unravel years of careful positioning. This awareness did not slow him, it sharpened him. Personal relationships during this time were limited and controlled. Trust was extended selectively and withdrawn quickly when questioned. Emotional distance protected him from vulnerability. Those closest to him often described a calm intensity, a sense that he was always evaluating, always calculating. Friendship and business blurred, but business always came first. By the time Whitey fully established himself within Boston's criminal hierarchy, his transformation was complete. The boy shaped by poverty and the young man hardened by prison had merged into something more formidable. He was no longer reacting to his environment, he was shaping it. This period marked the true beginning of his reign, though few recognized it as such at the time. There were no headlines announcing his rise, no dramatic confrontations signaling a shift in power. Instead, control settled quietly into place, like a shadow stretching across familiar ground. What came next would elevate his influence beyond the streets and into the institutions meant to oppose him. But for now, Whitey Bulger had achieved something rare in the criminal world, sustained authority without spectacle. And in the quiet neighborhoods of Boston, that kind of power proved far more enduring than anyone realized. Power within the Winter Hill Gang did not arrive through ceremony or formal titles. It emerged through presence, through the quiet understanding that certain decisions no longer required debate. By the time Whitey Bulger's influence became unmistakable, it had already been in place for years, woven so tightly into the gang's operations that few could remember when it began. Leadership, in this world, was not announced. It was assumed. The Winter Hill Gang operated differently from the Italian mafia families that dominated organized crime in other cities. There were no rigid codes, no elaborate initiation rituals, no centralized hierarchy enforced by tradition. Instead, authority shifted based on effectiveness. Those who made money, managed conflict, and minimized attention from law enforcement naturally rose. Whitey thrived in this environment. His discipline, patience, and strategic thinking aligned perfectly with a structure that rewarded results over image. At the heart of the gang's power were its rackets, gambling operations tucked into back rooms, loan-sharking schemes that preyed on desperation, protection money collected from businesses that preferred quiet compliance over unpredictable consequences. These activities were not glamorous, but they were steady. They generated cash reliably, day after day, and stability was valued more than spectacle. Whitey understood this instinctively. He focused on efficiency. Debts were tracked carefully. Collections followed predictable schedules. Violence, when necessary, was calculated to send clear messages without inviting retaliation or investigation. Under his influence, the gang's operations became smoother, more disciplined. Mistakes were addressed internally and swiftly. Loose ends were not tolerated. Fear remained a central tool, but it was applied sparingly. Whitey believed that constant brutality attracted attention and weakened control. Instead, he cultivated an atmosphere where consequences were understood without being frequently demonstrated. Stories circulated quietly. People talked among themselves. A single incident, if handled decisively, could reinforce authority for years. This approach reduced the need for ongoing violence while maintaining its effectiveness. Within the gang, loyalty was transactional but deeply enforced. Those who followed orders, kept silent, and delivered results were protected and rewarded. Those who faltered were given limited opportunities to correct course. Repeated failures or signs of betrayal were not debated, they were resolved. Whitey did not rule through charisma or warmth. He ruled through consistency. People knew what to expect, and that predictability fostered compliance. His role expanded beyond daily operations into arbitration. Disputes between members, disagreements over territory, and conflicts with rival groups were brought to him. He listened more than he spoke, weighing outcomes rather than emotions. Decisions were delivered calmly, often without explanation. The absence of justification reinforced authority, orders did not need to be defended. Rival gangs watched these developments carefully. Some attempted to challenge Winter Hill's expanding influence, testing boundaries through minor encroachments or indirect pressure. Whitey responded strategically. Rather than escalating conflicts openly, he isolated threats, cutting off revenue streams or turning rivals against one another. In several cases, challengers simply faded from prominence, their operations quietly dismantled. This method of control extended beyond criminal circles into the broader community. Business owners, local figures, and even residents who were not involved in crime understood where influence lay. Payments were made on time. Questions were not asked. Whitey's presence became a stabilizing force, unsettling, but predictable. In neighborhoods accustomed to uncertainty, predictability carried its own form of comfort. At the same time, Whitey maintained deliberate distance from the public face of the gang. He avoided unnecessary displays of wealth or authority. He dressed plainly, moved without entourage, and spoke casually with neighbors. This contrast between private power and public normalcy insulated him. Law enforcement attention gravitated toward louder figures, those who sought recognition or indulged in excess. Whitey preferred anonymity. Internally, he encouraged compartmentalization. Members were discouraged from knowing more than necessary. Information flowed upward, rarely sideways. This structure reduced the risk of exposure if someone was arrested or turned informant. It also centralized control. Whitey knew more than anyone else, and that knowledge reinforced his position. Trust, however, remained limited. Years of observation had convinced him that betrayal was inevitable under pressure. Rather than hoping for loyalty, he planned for its absence. Contingencies were built into every operation. No single person held irreplaceable knowledge. No one was beyond suspicion, including longtime associates. This mindset created an atmosphere of quiet tension within the gang. People respected Whitey, but they also feared him, not just for his capacity for violence, but for his ability to anticipate betrayal. Conversations were guarded. Secrets were kept. The silence that protected the gang also isolated its members from one another, reinforcing dependence on leadership. As the Winter Hill Gang's influence expanded, it increasingly intersected with larger criminal networks, including Italian mafia families. These relationships were complex, sometimes cooperative, sometimes adversarial. Whitey navigated them cautiously, recognizing both opportunity and risk. He avoided unnecessary confrontations while asserting boundaries when challenged. Respect, in these circles, was negotiated continuously. One of his most significant achievements during this period was maintaining stability amid constant external pressure. Law enforcement activity ebbed and flowed, but the gang adapted. Operations shifted locations. Methods evolved. Whitey emphasized flexibility, understanding that rigidity invited disruption. This adaptability allowed Winter Hill to endure while other groups fractured. Yet beneath this success lay a growing paradox. The more disciplined and effective the gang became, the more attention it eventually attracted. Power, even when exercised quietly, leaves traces. Whitey understood this, but he believed he could manage it. His confidence was not rooted in arrogance, but in experience. He had navigated prison, rivalries, and shifting alliances. He trusted his ability to adapt again. This era represented the height of his internal authority. Without formal title or ceremony, he became the unquestioned center of the Winter Hill Gang. Decisions flowed through him. Fear radiated outward. Silence followed his presence. He had achieved what few criminals manage, a form of rule that did not require constant reinforcement. And yet, the very qualities that sustained his power, secrecy, control, calculated restraint, were also setting the stage for something far more dangerous. As his influence grew, so did the potential consequences of exposure. The systems he manipulated would not remain static forever. For now, though, Whitey Bulger ruled without a crown, guided by an understanding that true power rarely announces itself. It settles quietly, waits patiently, and reshapes its environment from within. The streets of Boston continued their routines, unaware that they were living under an authority as effective as it was invisible. The relationship that would ultimately define Whitey Bulger's reign did not begin with handshakes or written agreements. It began quietly, through observation and opportunity, in the spaces where criminal ambition and institutional pressure intersect. By the mid-1970s, Boston's underworld was crowded with competing interests, and law enforcement faced growing frustration in its attempts to penetrate organized crime networks. Informants were unreliable. Loyalties shifted quickly. And the Italian mafia, with its rigid codes and deep-rooted secrecy, remained particularly difficult to infiltrate. It was within this climate that the FBI began looking for alternative strategies. Rather than dismantling criminal organizations from the outside, agents sought to exploit internal rivalries. The idea was simple in theory: turn one criminal against another, and let ambition do the work. In practice, this approach carried significant risk, especially when the informant possessed power, intelligence, and his own agenda. Whitey Bulger was well aware of this dynamic long before the FBI approached him directly. Years of observation had taught him that law enforcement relied heavily on information, and that information was often incomplete. He understood that the right knowledge, delivered selectively, could buy time, protection, and leverage. When the opportunity presented itself, he was prepared. The connection between Bulger and the FBI was facilitated through John Connolly, an agent who shared a similar South Boston background. They spoke the same cultural language, understood the same neighborhood codes, and carried a shared sense of identity shaped by place. This familiarity created trust, or at least the appearance of it. To Connolly, Bulger represented a valuable asset, someone positioned close enough to rival gangs, particularly the Italian mafia, to provide insights the Bureau desperately wanted. To Whitey, the relationship offered something far more valuable than money. It offered insulation. The early exchanges were cautious. Information passed in controlled fragments, enough to demonstrate usefulness without revealing everything. Bulger provided intelligence on rival criminals, sometimes accurate, sometimes strategically incomplete. Arrests followed. Investigations advanced. From the FBI's perspective, the arrangement appeared successful. A dangerous criminal organization was being weakened. From Whitey's perspective, the system was working exactly as intended. What made the relationship especially dangerous was the imbalance of perception. The FBI believed they were managing an informant. Whitey understood that he was managing a system. He grasped the reality that law enforcement agencies, like criminal ones, operated under pressure to produce results, justify budgets, and demonstrate progress. By feeding the Bureau carefully selected victories, he strengthened his own position. Protection did not come in the form of explicit immunity. Instead, it appeared subtly. Investigations stalled. Tips went unpursued. Arrest warrants were delayed or quietly dismissed. Whitey noticed these patterns and adjusted accordingly. Each sign of leniency confirmed that the relationship was deeper than officially acknowledged. Over time, the boundaries between informant and protected asset blurred. Whitey began using his FBI connection to eliminate rivals indirectly. By providing information that led to arrests of competing criminals, he reshaped the underworld to his advantage. Those who threatened his operations found themselves targeted by law enforcement, while his own activities continued largely undisturbed. This manipulation extended beyond rival gangs. Potential informants within his own organization became liabilities. Whitey was acutely aware that the FBI valued information above all else. Anyone who might speak to authorities represented a direct threat, not just to his freedom, but to the delicate balance he had engineered. The consequences for such threats were severe and final. The relationship also reinforced Whitey's belief that institutions were inherently self-serving. The FBI, in his view, was willing to overlook violence and corruption as long as it served a broader objective. This belief did not trouble him morally, it validated his worldview. Everyone had a price. Everyone acted in their own interest. He simply understood the system better than most. For Agent Connolly, the dynamic grew increasingly complicated. Professional boundaries eroded as personal loyalty and ambition became entangled. Success bred confidence. Confidence bred complacency. Warnings from within the Bureau were dismissed. Questions were deflected. The flow of information continued, largely unchallenged. Meanwhile, the streets of Boston felt the effects immediately. Rivals disappeared. Investigations focused elsewhere. Whitey's reputation for being untouchable solidified. People whispered that he had friends in high places, though few understood the extent of the protection. Fear deepened, not just of Whitey himself, but of the system that seemed to shield him. This period marked a profound shift in his power. No longer was he merely a criminal navigating law enforcement pressure, he was influencing it. The distinction mattered. It allowed him to operate with unprecedented confidence, expanding his control while minimizing risk. Decisions became bolder, punishments more decisive. The knowledge that he was buffered by federal protection altered his calculations. Yet even as the relationship strengthened, it remained fragile. It depended on secrecy, mutual benefit, and the absence of scrutiny. Whitey understood this vulnerability and guarded it carefully. He limited who knew about the arrangement. He avoided direct documentation. Conversations remained informal. Plausible deniability was essential. Ironically, the very secrecy that protected the relationship also concealed its dangers. Within the FBI, few fully understood the scope of Bulger's criminal activities. Violence attributed to him was often dismissed or minimized. The narrative focused on the intelligence he provided, not the cost at which it came. This selective vision allowed the partnership to persist far longer than it should have. For Whitey, the alliance confirmed a final, unsettling truth: power did not belong solely to criminals or authorities. It belonged to those who could move between worlds, exploiting the blind spots of each. He was no longer operating solely in the shadows, he was shaping where the light fell. The consequences of this arrangement would ripple outward for decades, leaving victims without justice and institutions stained by complicity. But at the time, none of that mattered to Whitey Bulger. What mattered was control, and for the first time in his life, he had achieved it on a scale few could imagine. What happened next would transform this quiet alliance into one of the most notorious failures in American law enforcement history. The same system that protected him would eventually turn inward, questioning its own integrity. And when that reckoning came, it would expose not just one man's crimes, but an entire culture of silence that had allowed them to flourish. Once Whitey Bulger understood that his position was insulated by more than street reputation, his approach to control hardened. The alliance with federal agents did not make him reckless, but it removed hesitation. Power, when paired with protection, carries a different weight. Decisions no longer revolved around survival alone, they revolved around permanence. To maintain that permanence, Whitey relied on a method he had refined over decades: the calculated removal of threats. Violence under his direction was never impulsive. It followed a deliberate internal logic shaped by risk assessment rather than emotion. Every potential target was evaluated carefully. Were they loyal? Were they desperate? Were they talking, or likely to talk? The answers determined outcomes. In a world where informants posed the greatest danger, suspicion alone could be fatal. What distinguished Whitey from many other crime bosses was his belief that betrayal did not need to be proven, it only needed to be plausible. He had seen enough pressure break men in prison and on the streets to know that fear of incarceration could override years of loyalty. Waiting for confirmation invited exposure. Acting preemptively, though brutal, reduced uncertainty. This philosophy created an atmosphere where silence was not just expected, it was enforced through example. The disappearances began to accumulate quietly. People were last seen entering familiar apartments, getting into cars with trusted faces, or attending routine meetings that never concluded. Bodies were hidden carefully, often buried in remote locations or sealed beneath concrete. The absence of public spectacle was intentional. There were no warnings, no displays meant to intimidate the public. The message was meant for a very specific audience, those close enough to understand. Rumors circulated through Boston's underworld, passed in hushed tones and incomplete sentences. Names were avoided. Details were left vague. The uncertainty itself became a weapon. People wondered who was next, who might already be marked. That fear discouraged cooperation with authorities more effectively than any threat could. Talking felt dangerous not because of immediate retaliation, but because of the possibility of vanishing without explanation. Whitey's involvement in these acts was often indirect, at least in appearance. He delegated tasks to trusted associates, ensuring layers of separation between himself and the violence. This insulation served multiple purposes. It reduced legal exposure, reinforced hierarchy, and maintained an image of composure. Even those who suspected his involvement rarely had proof. And proof, in this world, was the difference between rumor and consequence. Among those closest to him, loyalty was constantly tested. Whitey maintained detailed mental records of conversations, behaviors, and subtle changes in demeanor. A missed payment, a hesitant answer, or an unexpected question could trigger suspicion. He believed that the earliest signs of betrayal appeared not in actions, but in tone. This hypervigilance created an environment where everyone felt observed. When violence occurred, it was swift and final. There were no second chances, no negotiations. Once a decision was made, it was carried out without hesitation. This decisiveness reinforced his reputation. People knew that once crossed, there was no path back. This certainty discouraged challenges more effectively than random brutality ever could. The psychological toll of this approach was significant, though rarely acknowledged. Whitey's emotional detachment deepened, hardening into something closer to indifference. Human relationships became purely functional, sources of information, risk, or utility. Compassion had no place in calculations shaped by survival and dominance. Over time, this mindset isolated him further, reinforcing the belief that trust was an illusion. Yet even as his control intensified, Whitey remained acutely aware of the need to maintain balance. Excessive violence attracted attention. Each disappearance risked inquiry, even if bodies were never found. To mitigate this, he ensured that violence served a clear strategic purpose. Rivals were eliminated only when necessary. Associates were removed only when perceived as liabilities. Random acts had no place in his system. His FBI relationship played a subtle but crucial role in sustaining this balance. When rumors of violence surfaced, investigations often stalled or redirected. Tips were lost. Leads went cold. This pattern reinforced Whitey's confidence that he could act decisively without immediate consequence. The system, as he saw it, worked in his favor. For victims' families, the experience was devastating. Loved ones vanished without explanation, leaving behind unanswered questions and lingering grief. Official channels offered little assistance. Cases stagnated. The absence of closure compounded suffering. These human costs remained largely invisible within Whitey's calculations, absorbed into a worldview that prioritized control above all else. Within the criminal world, however, the effect was unmistakable. Whitey's authority became absolute. Challenges ceased. Internal dissent faded. Those who remained understood the boundaries clearly. The gang operated with a grim efficiency, unified by fear and dependence. Silence was no longer a code, it was a condition of survival. Ironically, the very success of this strategy planted the seeds of future collapse. Violence, even when hidden, leaves traces. Patterns emerge. Memories persist. People talk eventually, if only in private. Each act narrowed Whitey's margin for error, increasing the number of individuals who knew too much or had too much to lose. At the height of his power, however, these risks felt manageable. Whitey believed he could anticipate threats before they materialized. He trusted his instincts, honed through years of observation and experience. The possibility that the system itself might turn against him seemed remote. This phase of his life represented the darkest consolidation of his authority. Control was maintained not through charisma or persuasion, but through the certainty of consequence. Fear was the currency, silence the contract. Boston's underworld adjusted accordingly, reshaping itself around his presence. Yet beneath the surface, the pressure was building. The same methods that ensured obedience also created resentment and desperation. The same secrecy that protected him also isolated him. And the same alliance that shielded him would eventually draw scrutiny. For now, though, Whitey Bulger remained the unseen center of gravity in Boston's criminal world, a figure whose decisions rippled outward, unseen but deeply felt. His power was no longer just about territory or money. It was about control over outcomes, over narratives, over who remained and who disappeared. And in that quiet dominance, he believed he had finally secured his place beyond challenge. By the time Whitey Bulger reached the height of his influence, something unusual had settled over Boston's criminal landscape, a sense that certain rules no longer applied to him. Others worried about surveillance, indictments, and sudden arrests. Whitey moved through the city with a different confidence, one shaped not by arrogance, but by repeated proof that consequences rarely reached him. Investigations came and went. Names surfaced briefly and then disappeared. Those around him noticed as well. Conversations shifted. People spoke more cautiously. The idea that Whitey Bulger had powerful allies became an accepted truth, even if the details remained unclear. The illusion of immunity reshaped how Whitey operated. He did not abandon caution, but he expanded his reach. Operations grew bolder. Control tightened. The fear he inspired became more absolute, fueled by the belief that opposing him was futile. In a system where justice seemed selective, survival depended on alignment with power. Many chose compliance over resistance, convinced that the alternative was pointless. Law enforcement, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile conflicting narratives. On one hand, intelligence reports suggested Whitey's deep involvement in violent crime. On the other, he was classified as a valuable informant. This contradiction created paralysis. Agents hesitated to pursue aggressive action, wary of disrupting a source deemed critical to larger investigations. Responsibility diffused across departments. No single office took ownership. In this environment, inaction became the default. Whitey understood this institutional hesitation intuitively. He recognized that large organizations moved slowly, constrained by bureaucracy and internal politics. Decisions required consensus. Accountability was shared and therefore diluted. By positioning himself at the intersection of competing priorities, he exploited the system's weaknesses. As long as he remained useful, scrutiny softened. This dynamic extended beyond federal agencies into local law enforcement. Information traveled unevenly. Some officers suspected corruption but lacked proof. Others accepted official narratives at face value. The complexity of jurisdiction, local police, state authorities, federal agents, created gaps that Whitey navigated with ease. Each layer of bureaucracy added another buffer between him and accountability. The psychological impact of this protection was profound. For Whitey, it reinforced a worldview in which rules were tools rather than constraints. Morality, already secondary, became irrelevant. If the system could be manipulated, then outcomes mattered more than principles. This mindset justified actions that might have once seemed excessive. He was not breaking the rules, he was using them. For those beneath him, the illusion of his invincibility intensified fear. People who might have considered cooperation with authorities abandoned the idea. Why risk everything when the person you reported seemed untouchable? This chilling effect extended far beyond his immediate circle, shaping behavior across the criminal ecosystem. Silence deepened. The code became absolute. Yet the illusion required constant maintenance. Whitey remained vigilant, feeding the FBI enough information to sustain his value while withholding anything that could expose him. He monitored internal discussions closely, watching for signs of shifting priorities or skepticism. The relationship was not static, it required management. At the same time, cracks began forming quietly. Journalists asked questions. Internal reviews surfaced inconsistencies. A few investigators grew uneasy with the lack of progress on cases linked to Whitey's associates. These concerns rarely reached him directly, but he sensed them. His experience had taught him that systems rarely collapse suddenly, they erode slowly. Despite this, his confidence remained strong. Years of success had conditioned him to expect favorable outcomes. Each avoided consequence reinforced belief in his own control. The absence of immediate danger made long-term risk feel abstract. This psychological insulation was perhaps his greatest vulnerability. The illusion also masked the human cost of his immunity. Families searched for answers that never came. Communities absorbed trauma quietly. Trust in institutions eroded. These consequences unfolded slowly, often invisibly, while Whitey's daily life continued largely undisturbed. He attended neighborhood gatherings, walked familiar streets, and maintained routines that suggested normalcy. This contrast between appearance and reality deepened the story's unsettling nature. Power operated not through spectacle, but through absence, of arrests, of accountability, of closure. The very quietness of the system's failure made it harder to confront. There was no single moment to point to, no dramatic confrontation to demand change. Whitey's belief in his own protection also influenced how he treated those around him. He grew less tolerant of perceived weakness, less patient with dissent. If the system itself bent to his advantage, why should individuals be treated gently? This logic hardened his approach, increasing the severity of internal discipline and narrowing the circle of trust. And yet, even at the height of his apparent immunity, uncertainty lingered. Whitey was too experienced to believe in absolute safety. He continued to plan for contingencies, maintaining escape routes and monitoring potential threats. His confidence was real, but it was not naive. He understood that protection depended on utility, and utility could expire. The question, though, was when. The illusion of being above the law is seductive. It dulls caution, reshapes priorities, and blurs consequences. For Whitey Bulger, it allowed him to consolidate power more completely than ever before. But illusions, by nature, rely on perception. Once that perception shifts, collapse can follow swiftly. For now, the system appeared to hold. Investigations stalled. Files remained closed. Whitey continued his reign, seemingly untouched. But beneath the surface, pressure was building, quietly, persistently. And when it finally broke through, it would not just expose one man's crimes. It would force a reckoning with an entire structure that had allowed them to flourish unseen. In the stillness of those years, with no alarms sounding and no doors closing in, it was easy to believe the illusion would last forever. History, however, has a way of reminding even the most protected figures that no system remains static. The law, once delayed long enough, does not forget. In a city shaped by loyalty, tradition, and long memory, few contrasts were as striking as the lives of the Bulger brothers. Raised in the same small apartment in South Boston, shaped by the same economic hardship and neighborhood codes, James, Whitey Bulger and his younger brother William, known to most as Billy, followed paths that diverged sharply while running in parallel. One operated in the shadows, enforcing silence through fear. The other stood in the open, speaking the language of law, governance, and public service. Together, they embodied a contradiction that defined Boston for decades. Billy Bulger's ascent into politics followed a trajectory that appeared almost inevitable in hindsight. He was disciplined, articulate, and deeply attuned to the rhythms of his community. Teachers recognized his potential early. Where Whitey learned to distrust institutions, Billy learned how to navigate them. He understood process, protocol, and the power of legitimacy. Over time, he became a respected figure in Massachusetts politics, eventually serving as president of the Massachusetts State Senate. His influence was public, his authority formal. Whitey watched this rise from a distance, aware of the irony but never openly resentful. In his mind, both brothers sought control, only through different mechanisms. Billy wielded influence through speeches, committees, and legislation. Whitey wielded it through reputation, fear, and unspoken agreements. Each, in his own way, shaped the city they loved. The existence of these parallel lives raised questions that lingered without clear answers. How much did Billy know about Whitey's criminal activities? How much did he choose not to know? The truth, as with many aspects of this story, resists simplicity. Billy maintained that he was unaware of the full extent of his brother's crimes, and there is no definitive evidence that he participated in or condoned them. Yet the overlap between their spheres created unavoidable tension. In Boston, perception often matters as much as reality. The fact that Whitey's brother occupied one of the most powerful political positions in the state fueled speculation. People whispered about influence and protection, about favors quietly exchanged or investigations subtly discouraged. Even when unproven, these rumors contributed to Whitey's aura of untouchability. The idea that he was connected to legitimate power reinforced fear and resignation. Billy's political career was built on advocacy for working-class communities, including South Boston. He championed education, economic development, and neighborhood preservation. To many constituents, he was a symbol of opportunity, a local boy who had risen through effort and intelligence. This image stood in stark contrast to Whitey's hidden reign, yet both men benefited from the same community loyalty that valued family above all else. Family loyalty, in the Bulger household, was deeply ingrained. Disagreements were handled privately. Public criticism was avoided. This cultural instinct complicated any potential reckoning between the brothers. Even if Billy suspected wrongdoing, confronting it publicly would have carried enormous personal and political cost. Silence, in this context, could be interpreted as protection, denial, or simple survival. Whitey, for his part, rarely spoke about his brother's career. He understood the advantage of distance. Any visible connection risked drawing unwanted scrutiny. At the same time, he was aware that Billy's position offered a form of indirect insulation. Even without direct intervention, the mere possibility of political entanglement made agencies cautious. No one wanted to trigger a scandal without certainty. This unspoken dynamic reinforced the theme that ran throughout Whitey's life: power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it exists as implication. The suggestion of influence can be as effective as influence itself. In a city accustomed to backroom deals and quiet understandings, this ambiguity thrived. As Whitey's criminal activities intensified, the ethical gap between the brothers widened. While Billy debated policy and governance, Whitey orchestrated violence and extortion. Yet both operated within systems that rewarded loyalty and discouraged dissent. Both understood the value of silence. Both navigated environments where exposure carried consequences. The media eventually began drawing sharper attention to this contrast. Articles questioned how two brothers from the same background could embody such opposing roles. Public curiosity grew, especially as Whitey's name surfaced more frequently in connection with unsolved crimes. Billy faced increasing pressure to address these associations, though he continued to assert separation from his brother's activities. This scrutiny placed Billy in an impossible position. Acknowledging knowledge risked implication. Denial invited skepticism. The truth, likely complex and partial, offered little refuge. In this tension, the brothers' paths intersected indirectly, each shaping the other's legacy in ways neither fully controlled. Whitey's awareness of his brother's prominence also influenced his behavior. He was careful not to involve Billy directly, understanding that overt connections could destroy both of them. This restraint, however, did not diminish his willingness to exploit the broader perception of political protection. The line between coincidence and advantage blurred. As years passed, the contrast between the brothers became symbolic. They represented two faces of Boston's power structure, one legitimate, one illicit, existing simultaneously and feeding into the same cultural fabric. The city's ability to accommodate this contradiction spoke volumes about its complexities and compromises. Ultimately, the story of the Bulger brothers is not one of simple complicity or innocence. It is a story about environment, loyalty, and the ways power manifests differently depending on opportunity and choice. It forces uncomfortable questions about how societies define responsibility and how silence can function as both shield and weapon. When Whitey's world eventually collapsed, Billy's career suffered collateral damage. Investigations reopened. Old questions resurfaced. Trust eroded. The long shadow of Whitey's actions reached into institutions that had once seemed untouched. The parallel paths finally converged, not through cooperation, but through consequence. In reflecting on these intertwined lives, it becomes clear that Whitey Bulger did not rise alone. His story unfolded within a network of relationships, perceptions, and unspoken agreements. The contrast with his brother does not absolve or condemn either outright, but it reveals how power, once divided, can still originate from the same place. In Boston, the line between shadow and spotlight was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. For years, the system surrounding Whitey Bulger functioned with a strange, uneasy balance. Information flowed upward, protection flowed downward, and silence filled the space in between. But no structure built on secrecy remains perfectly sealed forever. Small fractures began to appear, subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss. A question raised in a hallway. A file reviewed twice instead of once. A journalist asking why certain names kept surfacing without consequence. None of these moments seemed dangerous on their own, but together they signaled that the silence was beginning to thin. Within the FBI itself, discomfort slowly took shape. Younger agents, removed from the original decisions that labeled Whitey a valuable informant, began noticing inconsistencies. Reports described him as a source of intelligence, yet rumors of his involvement in violent crimes persisted. Arrests linked to his rivals were frequent, while investigations tied to his own circle stalled inexplicably. To those looking closely, the pattern felt wrong. Institutional inertia delayed action. Files were passed between offices. Responsibility diffused across departments. No one wanted to challenge a strategy that had, at least on paper, delivered results against organized crime. Questioning the handling of a top informant risked internal conflict, professional backlash, and exposure of earlier misjudgments. It was easier to let the arrangement continue than to confront its implications. Whitey sensed the shift before it became visible. Experience had taught him that systems rarely collapse suddenly. They waver. They hesitate. They repeat questions that once had easy answers. He noticed changes in tone, in the timing of information requests, in the subtle distance that crept into conversations. The confidence he once felt in his protection did not vanish, but it became conditional. To maintain control, he adjusted his approach. Information provided to the FBI became more selective, more carefully framed. He offered just enough to remain useful without revealing vulnerabilities. At the same time, he increased internal surveillance within his organization. Loyalty checks became more frequent. Suspicions sharpened. The margin for error narrowed. Outside law enforcement, investigative journalists began assembling pieces that had long been scattered. Patterns of unsolved disappearances. Connections between victims. The recurring absence of accountability. These stories did not accuse outright, but they asked questions the public could not ignore. Each article chipped away at the illusion of randomness, suggesting design where once there was silence. Families of victims grew louder, refusing to accept vague explanations or stalled cases. Their persistence introduced emotional pressure into a system accustomed to detachment. Names that had been whispered privately began appearing in print. The past, long buried, showed signs of resurfacing. Whitey responded as he always had, with caution rather than panic. He believed that exposure, if it came, would still be manageable. He trusted his ability to adapt, to disappear if necessary, to outlast scrutiny. Yet even as he planned contingencies, an unfamiliar sensation crept in, uncertainty. Within his own mind, calculations grew more complex. The alliance that once felt like an advantage now carried risk. Protection depended on trust, and trust was eroding. He began to consider scenarios that once seemed unlikely. What if the FBI reassessed his value? What if internal investigations gained momentum? What if the narrative shifted? These questions did not lead to remorse. They led to preparation. Whitey tightened his inner circle further, reducing the number of people with access to sensitive information. He limited movements, varied routines, and paid closer attention to news coverage. Every signal mattered. A delayed call. A cancelled meeting. A name mentioned out of context. Paranoia, once controlled, edged closer to the surface. For those around him, the change was palpable. The calm authority remained, but it carried tension. Decisions were faster, punishments more severe. Whitey's patience shortened. The environment grew colder, less forgiving. Fear deepened, not just of consequences, but of unpredictability. Meanwhile, within federal offices, the weight of accumulated doubts grew harder to ignore. Internal reviews uncovered troubling details. Communications between agents raised ethical concerns. The line between informant management and complicity appeared dangerously thin. Slowly, cautiously, the system began turning inward. This inward turn was perhaps the most dangerous development of all. Whitey had always understood how to manipulate outward pressure, rivals, police, street threats. Institutional self-examination was different. It was quieter, more methodical, and harder to influence. Once initiated, it followed its own logic. Still, progress was slow. Bureaucracy resisted momentum. Careers, reputations, and legacies were at stake. The temptation to contain the damage rather than expose it fully was strong. Yet the accumulation of evidence made containment increasingly difficult. Whitey felt the ground shifting beneath him, though the surface still looked stable. He continued operating, but with heightened vigilance. Each decision carried the awareness that time might be narrowing. The future, once comfortably distant, pressed closer. What made this period especially unsettling was the absence of clarity. There was no clear threat to confront, no single enemy to neutralize. The danger lay in accumulation, in files, memories, and questions converging slowly. Whitey could not intimidate a system into forgetting itself. Despite this, he maintained outward composure. Panic, he knew, was contagious. Calm projected control. Control discouraged challenge. Even as doubt crept in, he presented certainty. But history often turns not on dramatic moments, but on quiet shifts in attention. The same system that had shielded him was now beginning to notice its own reflection. And once attention turns inward, silence becomes difficult to sustain. The cracks had not yet broken open, but they were spreading. The era of unquestioned protection was ending, even if no one could yet say how or when. Whitey Bulger had built his power on understanding systems better than others. Now he faced a system reconsidering itself. The question was no longer whether the silence would hold, but how much pressure it could withstand before giving way. When Whitey Bulger disappeared in December of 1994, there was no dramatic announcement, no public signal that one of the most powerful figures in Boston's underworld had vanished. He simply stopped appearing. Familiar routines were abandoned. Apartments were left behind. The streets that had once felt controlled by his presence continued without him, at least on the surface. To those who understood what his absence meant, it was immediately clear, Whitey had seen something coming. Years of instinct had taught him to recognize danger long before it arrived fully formed. The internal shifts within the FBI, the growing media attention, the tightening circle of unanswered questions, all of it added up. He did not wait for confirmation. Waiting had never been his way. Survival depended on timing, and in that moment, leaving was the only option that preserved control. He vanished quietly, taking with him only what was essential. There were no emotional goodbyes, no attempts to secure closure. People who had once relied on him were left without explanation. The suddenness reinforced the myth surrounding him: if someone like Whitey Bulger could disappear overnight, then nothing in that world was stable. Fear lingered even in his absence. The manhunt that followed was extensive, but unfocused. Authorities knew he was gone, but they did not know where he had gone or how far ahead of them he already was. Years of protection and compromised information had dulled investigative instincts. Leads were outdated. Surveillance methods were ineffective against someone who understood them so well. Whitey approached life on the run with the same discipline that had defined his rise. He did not seek isolation in remote wilderness or attempt to reinvent himself dramatically. Instead, he chose anonymity through normalcy. He blended into ordinary environments, adopting routines that attracted no attention. The goal was not to hide in darkness, but to disappear in plain sight. At his side was Catherine Gregg, a woman who shared his willingness to live quietly and avoid scrutiny. Together, they constructed a life defined by repetition and restraint. They moved periodically, never staying long enough to become memorable, yet long enough to establish routine. They rented modest apartments, paid in cash, and avoided social entanglements. Whitey adopted false identities with care. Names were chosen that did not stand out. Background details were kept minimal. Conversations remained superficial. He avoided forming relationships that might invite curiosity. Every interaction was filtered through a single question: does this increase exposure? Despite the constant risk, there was a strange calm to his fugitive years. The pressure of daily command was gone. There were no meetings to manage, no disputes to resolve, no networks to maintain. Power had been replaced by vigilance. Control by caution. In some ways, this life suited him. It rewarded discipline and punished excess. Authorities struggled to keep pace. Tips poured in from across the country, many of them contradictory or vague. Sightings were reported in cities large and small. Each lead consumed resources, yet few produced results. Whitey's understanding of law enforcement psychology allowed him to stay ahead. He avoided predictable patterns. He did not contact old associates. He resisted nostalgia. The FBI eventually placed him on its 10 most wanted list, a public acknowledgement of failure as much as determination. His face appeared on posters, websites, and television screens nationwide. Ironically, this visibility worked in his favor. People expected to find him hiding in shadows, not living quietly among them. The image of a dangerous criminal made it harder to imagine him as a neighbor buying groceries or walking along a beach. As years passed, the hunt grew colder. New cases took priority. Resources shifted. Whitey aged. His world narrowed further, defined by small routines and careful observation. He followed the news, monitoring investigations and internal reviews. Each article confirmed that he had left at the right moment. Yet life on the run carried its own costs. Freedom was conditional. Every unexpected knock triggered alertness. Every unfamiliar face required assessment. Trust was limited even with Catherine. Survival demanded emotional restraint. The past could not be revisited. The future could not be planned too far ahead. For Boston, his disappearance left a void. Without his presence, old tensions resurfaced. Power structures shifted. Law enforcement revisited cases that had long been dormant. Witnesses reconsidered silence. The city began to exhale, though it did not yet understand why. Whitey's absence allowed movement, but it also raised questions that refused to fade. Within federal agencies, the embarrassment deepened. How had one man evaded capture for so long? How had he vanished so completely? Internal reviews intensified. The focus turned inward, examining not just the failure to catch him, but the failures that had allowed him to thrive. The past could no longer be ignored. Whitey watched these developments from a distance, aware that time was both ally and enemy. The longer he remained free, the older he grew, the less likely capture seemed. Yet time also eroded certainty. Technology advanced. Memory faded unevenly. One mistake, one slip, could undo years of caution. Despite this risk, he did not rush. He understood that haste had no place in exile. Each day survived was a victory. Each routine completed without incident reinforced discipline. Life became small, but manageable. There were moments of reflection, though not regret. Whitey viewed his situation pragmatically. This was the outcome of a life built on calculated risk. He had always known that power was temporary. The fact that he had lasted as long as he did felt, to him, like confirmation of skill rather than indictment. Still, the sense of inevitability never fully disappeared. He understood history well enough to know that most fugitives are eventually found. The question was not if, but when, and whether that moment would arrive on his terms or the system's. For nearly 16 years, he remained just beyond reach, a shadow moving quietly through ordinary places. The world changed around him. Boston changed. Law enforcement changed. And somewhere in that slow transformation, the conditions that had once protected him continued to dissolve. His disappearance had bought him time, but time alone could not erase the past. The same patience that had carried him into power now carried him through obscurity. Whether it would be enough was a question that lingered silently, waiting for the moment when routine would finally fail. And when that moment came, it would arrive not with violence or chaos, but with the same quiet finality that had defined every major turn in his life. As the years passed and Whitey Bulger remained beyond reach, his absence took on a life of its own. He was no longer just a fugitive, he became an idea, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong within the systems meant to contain men like him. His face, frozen in aging photographs, stared out from wanted posters and television screens, a reminder that some shadows linger long after the figure has disappeared. The longer he remained free, the more his story grew beyond the man himself. The decision to place Whitey on the FBI's 10 most wanted list marked a turning point, not just in the search for him, but in how the public understood his significance. This was not a routine pursuit of a criminal. It was an acknowledgement of failure, an admission that one of the Bureau's former assets had outmaneuvered it for years. His name now carried weight far beyond Boston. He became part of a national conversation about corruption, accountability, and trust. Media attention intensified. Documentaries, investigative reports, and long-form articles attempted to untangle the contradictions of his life. How could someone responsible for such violence remain protected for so long? How had the system allowed it? Each retelling added layers to his legend, sometimes blurring fact and myth. In this retelling, Whitey was alternately portrayed as a criminal mastermind, a product of his environment, or a symptom of institutional decay. For Whitey, living quietly under assumed identities, this growing mythology was both dangerous and ironic. The more his face circulated, the harder it should have been to remain hidden. Yet the public image worked against accurate identification. People expected spectacle, a hardened criminal lurking in darkness. They did not expect an elderly man blending into coastal communities, following routines that drew no attention. Law enforcement efforts continued, but they lacked cohesion. Tips flooded in from across the country, many inspired by media coverage rather than evidence. Each report required investigation, stretching already thin resources. False leads became common. The search expanded geographically but lost focus. Whitey understood this dynamic well. He knew that visibility did not always translate to proximity. Technological advances slowly reshaped the hunt. Databases improved. Financial tracking became more sophisticated. Yet Whitey's habits, shaped long before digital footprints dominated daily life, remained effective. He avoided credit cards, limited travel, and maintained a low profile. The absence of online presence worked in his favor. His life existed mostly offline, beyond the reach of algorithms and alerts. Meanwhile, internal investigations within the FBI and Department of Justice deepened. The question was no longer just where Whitey was, but how he had been allowed to operate for so long. Testimonies revisited old decisions. Emails and reports were scrutinized. Careers were reassessed. The institution began grappling with its own reflection, and Whitey's name sat at the center of that uncomfortable reckoning. For the families of victims, this period was agonizing. Each headline renewed hope and frustration in equal measure. The continued focus on Whitey validated their belief that something had gone terribly wrong, yet the absence of closure prolonged their grief. Time passed, but wounds remained open. Justice felt suspended, waiting on the capture of a man who seemed increasingly unreal. Whitey's life on the run grew quieter as the years advanced. Age brought limitations. Energy waned. The routines that once felt strategic became necessary. Yet even as his physical world shrank, his symbolic presence expanded. He became shorthand for systemic failure, invoked in debates about informant handling and oversight. Public fascination with his story revealed a deeper discomfort. Whitey's case challenged the belief that justice, though imperfect, eventually prevails. His prolonged freedom suggested otherwise. It forced a confrontation with the idea that power, once entangled with authority, can distort outcomes profoundly. Despite this, there was no visible crack in his anonymity. He and Catherine Gregg continued their routines, choosing locations that offered both privacy and normalcy. They avoided excess. They avoided attention. The world around them changed rapidly, but their habits remained fixed, anchored in simplicity. Occasionally, a neighbor would recall an elderly couple who kept to themselves, polite but distant. These recollections, in hindsight, seemed obvious. At the time, they were unremarkable. This was the paradox of Whitey's fugitive years. He was one of the most wanted men in America, yet he lived an existence defined by invisibility. As anniversaries of his disappearance passed, speculation intensified. Some believed he had fled the country. Others assumed he had died quietly under an alias. Each theory reflected the uncertainty surrounding his fate. The absence of definitive information allowed imagination to fill gaps. Law enforcement agencies faced increasing pressure to resolve the case. Advances in forensic accounting, surveillance, and data analysis offered new tools. The search slowly narrowed, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through persistence. Patterns emerged. Small inconsistencies aligned. A picture began to form. Whitey, ever cautious, sensed the tightening net even if he could not see it fully. He adjusted routines subtly, but age made adaptation slower. The margin for error shrank. What once felt sustainable began to feel precarious. Still, there was no rush. He had survived decades by trusting patience. Each day that passed without consequence reinforced the habit. The idea that he might die free, never answering for his crimes, felt increasingly plausible. But history rarely unfolds in straight lines. The same attention that once scattered the search now focused it. The mythology that had protected him by obscuring reality began to clarify. Somewhere, in an ordinary place, the extraordinary story was nearing its turning point. Whitey Bulger had become a ghost with a name, a symbol drifting through public consciousness. Yet ghosts, no matter how elusive, are bound to the past. And the past, when examined closely enough, has a way of revealing where it has been hiding. The end of Whitey Bulger's long disappearance did not arrive with sirens or a chase through darkened streets. It came quietly, in an ordinary coastal neighborhood, far removed from the alleys and power structures that once defined his life. After nearly 16 years on the run, his capture unfolded with the same understated inevitability that had marked so many of his decisions. When the door finally opened in Santa Monica, it was not chaos that followed, but stillness. For years, investigators had refined their approach, shifting away from broad searches toward a more focused understanding of Bulger's habits. Tips had proven unreliable, but patterns endured. He preferred anonymity through routine. He stayed close to the ocean. He avoided excess. Slowly, these tendencies narrowed the search. Attention turned toward modest communities where an older couple living quietly might draw no notice. In June 2011, that patience paid off. Acting on a tip that emphasized his longtime companion rather than Bulger himself, federal agents identified a small apartment building in Santa Monica. The building was unremarkable, blending seamlessly into its surroundings. There were no signs of fortified defenses, no visible guards, no outward markers of danger. From the outside, it looked like the home of retirees. When agents approached, they did so with caution, aware that Bulger had a history of violence and access to weapons. Yet the moment of arrest was anticlimactic. There was no resistance. No attempt to flee. Bulger, now in his early 80s, answered the door calmly. The man who had once ruled through fear submitted without protest. The silence he had relied upon for so long enveloped the scene once more. Inside the apartment, investigators found evidence of careful preparation. Hidden compartments concealed cash and weapons, reminders that even in exile, Bulger never fully abandoned contingency planning. Yet the overall atmosphere was domestic, almost mundane. The contrast was striking. This was not the lair of a crime lord, but the quiet refuge of someone who had spent years perfecting invisibility. Catherine Gregg was arrested alongside him, her loyalty evident in her shared flight and long years of silence. Together, they had constructed a life defined by restraint. That life ended not with violence, but with a knock at the door. The simplicity of the moment underscored a central truth of Bulger's story: control often ends not in chaos, but in quiet resolution. News of his capture spread rapidly, reigniting public attention that had dulled over time. Headlines announced the fall of one of America's most notorious fugitives. For Boston, the reaction was complex. Relief mingled with disbelief. After years of unanswered questions, the idea that Whitey Bulger was finally in custody felt almost unreal. For victims' families, the arrest reopened wounds. Hope resurfaced, tempered by the knowledge that time had taken much from them already. Justice delayed does not restore what was lost, but it acknowledges suffering. For many, this moment marked the first step toward long-awaited answers. Within law enforcement, the capture triggered reflection as much as celebration. It forced a reckoning with past failures and compromises. The focus shifted from pursuit to accountability. How had Bulger evaded capture for so long? How had institutional decisions enabled his crimes? These questions would not fade with his arrest, they would intensify. Bulger himself appeared unchanged by the attention. In court appearances that followed, he displayed the same composure that had defined his rise. Age had slowed his body but not his demeanor. Observers noted the absence of visible regret or fear. He seemed to regard the proceedings as another phase to endure rather than a judgment to confront. The contrast between his former power and present reality was stark. Once, his decisions had shaped entire neighborhoods. Now, he was escorted by marshals, confined to holding cells, subject to schedules and rules he no longer controlled. The transition from fugitive to defendant was swift and irreversible. The arrest also shattered lingering myths. For years, speculation had suggested that Bulger might die free, never answering for his crimes. His capture proved otherwise. It demonstrated that patience, even when delayed, can yield results. Yet it also highlighted the cost of delay, the decades of suffering, the erosion of trust, the normalization of injustice. As Bulger was transferred back to Boston, the city prepared for a reckoning long postponed. Courtrooms would become stages for stories once buried. Witnesses would speak. Records would surface. The silence that had protected him would finally be broken, not by fear, but by procedure. The simplicity of his arrest did not diminish its significance. In fact, it amplified it. There was no spectacle to distract from the reality of what had occurred. A man who had manipulated systems and instilled fear had been undone by persistence and time. In the aftermath, questions lingered. Did Bulger expect this ending? Had he resigned himself to eventual capture, or had he believed his discipline would carry him through to the end? His outward calm offered few answers. He remained, as ever, controlled and unreadable. What followed would test not just Bulger, but the institutions that had once shielded him. Trials would expose uncomfortable truths. Reputations would suffer. The story would expand beyond one man to encompass a broader failure of oversight and ethics. For now, though, the long chase was over. The quiet apartment in Santa Monica stood empty, stripped of its anonymity. The ordinary streets returned to routine. And Whitey Bulger, once a master of shadows, was firmly in the light, where his past could no longer be ignored. The final chapters of his life would unfold not in secrecy, but under scrutiny. And in that transition from invisibility to exposure, the true cost of his reign would begin to surface. The courtroom where James, Whitey Bulger finally faced judgment was a place defined by restraint rather than spectacle. After decades of secrecy, fear, and unanswered questions, the process that followed his arrest moved deliberately, guided by procedure and law. There were no dramatic outbursts, no cinematic confrontations. Instead, the reckoning unfolded through testimony, documents, and the slow accumulation of truth. For many, this quiet formality felt both anticlimactic and necessary. Bulger entered the courtroom as an old man, physically diminished yet mentally composed. The years on the run and the weight of age had altered his appearance, but not his demeanor. He listened carefully, rarely reacting, maintaining a calm that had served him throughout his life. Observers noted the absence of visible remorse or anxiety. To Bulger, this was another environment to endure, governed by rules he intended to navigate as best he could. The charges against him were extensive, spanning decades of criminal activity. They included racketeering, extortion, drug trafficking, and responsibility for multiple murders. Each charge represented not just a legal allegation, but a fragment of history long denied acknowledgement. As prosecutors laid out their case, the scope of Bulger's influence became undeniable. Witnesses took the stand one by one, many of them former associates who had once operated under Bulger's authority. Their testimonies described a world governed by fear and loyalty, where silence was enforced through consequence. Some spoke hesitantly, their voices carrying the weight of years spent suppressing memory. Others were more direct, recounting events with detached clarity. Each account added texture to a story that had existed mostly in rumor. For the families of victims, these moments were profoundly emotional. Names were spoken aloud in a public forum for the first time. Stories once whispered privately entered the official record. Though no testimony could restore what was lost, acknowledgement itself carried meaning. It signaled that the silence imposed for so long was finally being lifted. The trial also exposed the troubling relationship between Bulger and federal authorities. Evidence revealed how his status as an informant had shielded him from scrutiny, allowing his crimes to continue unchecked. This aspect of the proceedings extended the impact beyond Bulger alone. It forced an examination of institutional decisions that prioritized short-term gains over long-term justice. Defense strategies focused on challenging witness credibility and minimizing Bulger's direct involvement. They emphasized the complexity of criminal networks and the unreliability of testimony from individuals seeking reduced sentences. These arguments followed predictable patterns, yet they struggled to counter the cumulative weight of evidence. Throughout the proceedings, Bulger remained mostly silent. When he did speak, it was measured and controlled. His composure reinforced the perception of someone who viewed the trial as a process rather than a moral reckoning. This detachment unsettled some observers, suggesting that even in the face of exposure, his internal framework remained unchanged. As the days passed, the courtroom atmosphere grew heavy with reflection. Journalists filled benches, documenting each development. The public followed closely, aware that this trial represented more than the fate of one man. It was a test of whether a system could confront its own failures openly. The verdict, when it came, was decisive. Bulger was found guilty on numerous counts, including responsibility for multiple murders. The decision carried a sense of finality, though it arrived years too late for many. Justice, long delayed, was finally pronounced. Sentencing followed, formalizing the outcome. Bulger received life imprisonment, a symbolic end to a life built on control and evasion. There was no dramatic reaction, no visible collapse. He accepted the sentence with the same calm that had defined his rise and fall. The system had spoken, and he adjusted. For Boston, the trial marked a turning point. Stories once buried resurfaced. Conversations long avoided became unavoidable. The city began reckoning with its past, acknowledging not just Bulger's crimes, but the conditions that allowed them to persist. Trust in institutions had been shaken, but exposure offered the possibility of repair. The trial also prompted reforms within law enforcement, particularly in informant handling and oversight. Policies were reviewed. Safeguards strengthened. While these changes could not undo past harm, they aimed to prevent repetition. The legacy of Bulger's case extended into future practice. For the victims' families, closure remained complicated. Verdicts do not erase grief. Time does not restore what was taken. Yet the acknowledgement of truth mattered. It validated experiences long dismissed or ignored. In that recognition, some measure of peace emerged. As Bulger was led away after sentencing, the image contrasted sharply with his former life. Once feared and untouchable, he now moved within constraints he could not influence. The power he had wielded was gone, replaced by routine and confinement. The trial did not answer every question. Some details remained obscured by time or death. Some motivations remained unknowable. But it accomplished something essential: it brought a hidden history into the open. In the end, the courtroom proved more effective than any pursuit or confrontation. It transformed rumor into record, silence into testimony. For a man who had relied on secrecy above all else, exposure was the most profound consequence of all. And as the doors closed behind him, the long chapter of unchecked power ended, not with violence or escape, but with acknowledgement, accountability, and the slow work of truth. Life after sentencing settled into a rhythm that stood in stark contrast to everything Whitey Bulger had once controlled. The transfer from courtroom to prison marked not just a change of location, but a fundamental shift in identity. He was no longer a figure whose name commanded silence or hesitation. Inside the federal prison system, he was simply another inmate, defined by a number, a schedule, and a set of rules that no longer bent to his will. Prison life at this stage was quieter than the institutions he had known in his younger years. Age had altered the environment as much as it had altered him. The urgency of dominance and posturing that characterized many prison yards gave way to routines shaped by medical appointments, regulated movement, and long hours of stillness. Days unfolded predictably, measured by counts, meals, and brief periods of activity. For Whitey, this predictability was familiar. He had lived under confinement before, and he understood how to survive within rigid structures. Yet this time, there was no anticipation of release, no strategy for reintegration. Life sentences remove future bargaining. Time no longer stretches forward with possibility, it compresses inward. He approached incarceration with the same emotional restraint that had defined his life. There were no visible displays of bitterness or regret. He followed rules where it served him and tested boundaries quietly where he believed it safe to do so. Guards described him as controlled, observant, and reserved. He did not seek attention, nor did he retreat entirely into isolation. Instead, he occupied a narrow middle space, maintaining awareness without engagement. The loss of authority was absolute. Decisions were no longer his to make. Movement required permission. Privacy was minimal. Even silence, once his greatest weapon, now belonged to the institution rather than him. The environment he had once manipulated so effectively had reversed its roles. He was now the one being monitored, scheduled, and contained. Other inmates recognized his name, though reactions varied. Some regarded him with curiosity, others with caution. The reputation he carried did not disappear overnight, but it functioned differently inside. Stories held less power than present behavior. Age and physical limitation reduced the threat he once posed. Respect, where it existed, was muted and conditional. Whitey kept his interactions limited. Conversations remained brief and superficial. Trust was unnecessary and potentially dangerous. He had long believed that proximity bred vulnerability, and prison reinforced this belief. Solitude, though imposed, aligned with his instincts. He spent hours reading, thinking, and observing. Reflection came without sentimentality. He reviewed the past as one might examine a completed structure, analyzing its design rather than mourning its collapse. Medical needs increasingly shaped his days. The body that had once endured prison, violence, and flight now required care. Aging in confinement carries its own quiet weight. Physical decline becomes unavoidable. Independence erodes gradually. This process, slow and undeniable, reduced the illusion of control further. No amount of discipline could reverse time. Despite this, Whitey did not appear broken. He adapted, as he always had. The absence of future prospects narrowed focus to the present moment. Each day survived was sufficient. There was no longer a need to strategize beyond immediate conditions. This narrowing of scope brought a strange calm, stripped of ambition and expectation. Outside the prison walls, reactions to his incarceration evolved. Media attention faded as new stories emerged. The public's fascination cooled, replaced by a quieter acknowledgement that the chapter had closed. For victims' families, the knowledge that he was confined offered some measure of relief, though it did not erase loss. Closure remained partial, shaped by time and acceptance rather than resolution. Within the system, Whitey's presence continued to carry symbolic weight. He represented a cautionary example, a reminder of the consequences of compromised oversight and unchecked informant relationships. Training programs and policy discussions referenced his case, using it as a lesson in institutional vulnerability. Whitey was largely insulated from these broader conversations. His world had contracted to walls, corridors, and schedules. News arrived filtered and delayed. The past, once so immediate, became distant. Yet even in isolation, the consequences of his life echoed around him, in the guarded distance of staff, in the careful placement of housing, in the procedures designed to prevent incidents. Emotionally, there were no signs of reconciliation or remorse. Whitey had long compartmentalized responsibility, and that habit endured. He did not seek forgiveness, nor did he express regret publicly. His worldview remained intact, actions had outcomes, power had limits, survival required adaptation. Moral reflection had never been central to his thinking. This absence of introspection unsettled some observers. They expected age and confinement to soften him, to produce confessions or apologies. Instead, he remained consistent. The same internal logic that had guided his rise guided his endurance. He accepted his situation not as punishment, but as condition. The irony of his confinement was difficult to ignore. A man who had controlled fear now lived under constant supervision. A figure who had manipulated institutions was now fully subject to them. The reversal was complete, yet it lacked drama. There were no grand gestures, no final statements. Just routine. As months turned into years, Whitey's presence became another fixed element of the prison environment. Staff rotated. Inmates came and went. He remained. Time moved differently now, less marked by events and more by repetition. The intensity of the past faded into memory. And yet, even in this reduced existence, his story was not finished. The same systems that had once protected him had not entirely finished their reckoning. Legal proceedings continued elsewhere. Reputations were still being reassessed. Even so, his reputation followed him, arriving before he did. Prison systems are designed to contain, but they are also ecosystems shaped by memory and history. Inmates talk. Stories circulate. Names carry meaning long after the circumstances that created them have changed. Whitey's name, associated with betrayal, informant status, and long-standing grievances, carried particular weight. For some, it represented unresolved anger, a symbol of injustice that had never fully been addressed. His transfer placed him in a facility that housed inmates with violent histories, including individuals connected to organized crime. On paper, procedures existed to manage risk, especially for high-profile prisoners. In practice, transitions are moments of vulnerability. Routines are unfamiliar. Protective structures are not yet fully established. For someone like Whitey, whose life had been defined by careful anticipation, this sudden exposure carried danger. The morning of his death unfolded without warning. There was no prolonged build-up, no opportunity for negotiation or escape. Within the confines of the prison, violence returned to him in a form stripped of symbolism. It was swift and final. By the time authorities intervened, there was nothing to reverse. News of his death spread quickly, rippling outward through media and public consciousness. Reactions varied widely. Some expressed shock that such a figure could meet such an end after surviving so much. Others viewed it as an inevitable consequence, a closing of a circle long overdue. For victims' families, emotions were complex. Relief, anger, and a sense of unfinished business coexisted uneasily. There was no trial for his death, no extended public reckoning within the prison itself. Investigations followed protocol, confirming what had occurred without revisiting the deeper history that had brought him there. In death, as in life, many questions remained unanswered. Whitey's passing underscored a harsh reality about violence and power. Systems can delay consequences, redirect them, or soften their visibility, but they rarely erase them entirely. The life he had lived, defined by control and fear, ended not with redemption or reflection, but with exposure to the same forces he had once wielded. In the aftermath, discussions resurfaced about how such an outcome had been possible. Questions were raised about prison placement, oversight, and risk assessment. These conversations echoed earlier debates about institutional responsibility, reinforcing a central theme of his story: failures rarely occur in isolation. They accumulate through decisions made quietly, incrementally, and often with short-term logic. For the broader public, his death closed a chapter that had spanned generations. Younger audiences knew him primarily as a name in documentaries and articles. Older ones remembered the atmosphere of fear that once permeated Boston's neighborhoods. With his passing, the living connection to that era dissolved, leaving history to carry the weight. What lingered most strongly was the contrast between the power he once commanded and the vulnerability of his final moments. The man who had manipulated alliances and enforced silence ended his life unable to influence even the conditions of his confinement. The reversal was complete, yet it lacked the dramatic symmetry often imagined in stories of downfall. Reality, in this case, was quieter and more unsettling. For those who studied his life, his death reinforced the idea that legacy is not defined solely by control, but by consequence. Whitey Bulger's influence had reshaped institutions, communities, and policies. His actions prompted reforms, investigations, and lasting skepticism toward unchecked authority. These effects outlived him. In the days following his death, official statements were brief. The prison system acknowledged the event and moved forward. The absence of ceremony reflected the institutional need for continuity. Lives ended, schedules resumed. The machinery of confinement does not pause for symbolism. Yet outside those walls, reflection continued. Writers, historians, and observers revisited the arc of his life, searching for meaning in its conclusion. Some saw irony. Others saw inevitability. Few saw justice in a complete sense. The suffering he caused could not be balanced by the manner of his death. What his passing ultimately revealed was the emptiness at the core of power built on fear. Control, when stripped of context and audience, offers no protection. The silence he once commanded did not follow him into death. Instead, it was replaced by interpretation, debate, and memory. Whitey Bulger did not leave behind a legacy of complexity or contradiction so much as one of clarity. His life demonstrated how systems can be bent, how loyalty can be enforced, and how consequences can be delayed, but not avoided entirely. In the end, the same violence he had normalized found its way back to him, not as spectacle, but as closure. The story did not end with understanding or reconciliation. It ended with finality. A body. A report. A line drawn under a long and damaging chapter. And in that final stillness, the city he once dominated continued on, changed but enduring. The shadows he cast faded gradually, replaced by quieter lessons about power, accountability, and the cost of silence. Whitey Bulger's life and crimes exist in a space where myth and reality intertwine, creating a narrative that is as compelling as it is unsettling. Over the decades, his story has been told and retold through newspapers, documentaries, books, and films, each version emphasizing different aspects: the criminal mastermind, the shadowy informant, the untouchable gangster, or the elusive fugitive. In each retelling, elements are amplified, details omitted, and moral clarity blurred, producing a legend that often obscures the human cost behind it. Separating the man from the myth requires careful consideration, looking beyond sensational headlines to the concrete facts of his life. The myth of Whitey Bulger often portrays him as a larger-than-life figure, a clever, untouchable criminal who outwitted law enforcement for decades. This narrative emphasizes his cunning, his strategic mind, and the seeming invulnerability he maintained while orchestrating a reign of terror in Boston. Films and dramatizations capture the tension, the danger, and the charisma that allegedly drew people to him. They frame him as a symbol of rebellion against authority, a figure capable of bending systems to his will, almost superhuman in his foresight and influence. Reality, however, is more measured and, in many ways, more disturbing. Whitey Bulger was a man who relied on fear, manipulation, and calculated violence to maintain control. His ability to evade law enforcement was not solely the result of brilliance or strategy, it was facilitated by systemic failures, compromised institutions, and long-standing complicity. He was protected, whether knowingly or inadvertently, by law enforcement agencies that prioritized information over justice, allowing him to operate largely unchallenged for years. This reality strips away the romanticized notion of genius and reveals the structural weaknesses that allowed his crimes to persist. Part of the myth involves the perception of invulnerability. Media coverage and popular culture often highlight his elusiveness, his ability to disappear and resurface, and his mastery of criminal networks. Yet the truth is less glamorous. His disappearance in 1994, while impressive in terms of evading capture, was not a daring escape executed with ingenuity, it was a cautious withdrawal, meticulously planned and maintained through discipline and concealment. His life as a fugitive was defined not by action, but by restraint. The romanticized image of a criminal moving boldly through cities is replaced by the reality of an aging man living in careful anonymity, avoiding risk at every turn. Another aspect of the myth focuses on loyalty and the portrayal of Whitey as a protector of his community. Some narratives suggest that he maintained influence in South Boston not only through fear, but through a form of guardianship, caring for his neighbors, preserving certain norms, or distributing resources selectively. While he did cultivate ties within his neighborhood, these relationships were transactional, often reinforced by implicit threat rather than genuine protection. The reality is that many residents lived under a persistent sense of anxiety, aware that defiance or curiosity could carry fatal consequences. The human cost of his control, the disappearances, extortion, and intimidation, was enormous, yet it is often downplayed in stories that emphasize his perceived community loyalty. Whitey's status as an FBI informant further complicates the myth. Popular narratives sometimes frame this relationship as a strategic masterstroke, portraying him as a double agent who manipulated the government as skillfully as he did the underworld. While there is truth in his use of information to maintain power, the reality is that this alliance was both dangerous and morally corrosive. It allowed him to eliminate rivals under the guise of cooperation, while law enforcement failed to protect those who became collateral damage. The arrangement exemplifies how institutional compromise can perpetuate harm, a nuance frequently overshadowed by dramatized depictions of cunning or cleverness. Media and public fascination often emphasize the dramatic aspects of his life, the long manhunt, the colorful personality, the intricate criminal networks. But these elements, while compelling, risk obscuring the long-term consequences of his actions. Families of victims endured decades of fear, loss, and uncertainty. Communities were reshaped by intimidation and control. These realities are less cinematic than evasion or confrontation, yet they are central to understanding the full scope of Bulger's life. Separating myth from reality also involves acknowledging the ordinary elements of his existence that contrast sharply with the legend. For years, he lived quietly with Catherine Gregg in small, unremarkable apartments, blending into communities in ways that drew little attention. His days were marked by routine, caution, and careful avoidance of exposure. This version of his life, quiet, disciplined, hidden, is far less glamorous than the popular image of a fearless fugitive constantly outmaneuvering authorities. It demonstrates that survival, not spectacle, drove his actions during those years. Understanding Whitey Bulger through the lens of reality also requires examining his psychological framework. He operated with a mindset shaped by environment, experience, and survival instincts. Fear and control were tools, relationships were transactional, and loyalty was conditional. These traits, developed over decades, explain both his capacity to dominate Boston's criminal underworld and his ability to remain hidden for years. They do not make him admirable, they make him methodical, calculating, and dangerous. Ultimately, untangling myth from reality is not an exercise in diminishing his story, but in humanizing it, and in doing so, acknowledging the true impact of his actions. Myths can simplify, dramatize, or romanticize, often at the expense of understanding. Reality presents a more nuanced, uncomfortable truth. Whitey Bulger was neither a criminal genius nor a folkloric antihero. He was a man who exploited fear, institutions, and relationships, leaving a trail of destruction that extended far beyond his personal legend. The contrast between the myth and the reality also serves as a cautionary lesson about power and perception. Public fascination with figures like Whitey Bulger can obscure systemic failures and human suffering. Stories that focus solely on evasion, cleverness, or charisma risk glamorizing actions that were devastating and deadly in practice. By examining the factual record, acknowledging the institutional complicity, and centering the experiences of victims, a more accurate, and ultimately more sobering, portrait emerges. In reflecting on Whitey Bulger, it becomes clear that myths endure because they simplify complexity, offering a narrative that is easy to digest. Reality, however, is more uncomfortable, demanding attention to nuance, moral ambiguity, and the consequences of decisions made in the shadows. Separating the two does not diminish the fascination with his story, it deepens it, providing insight into how one man could shape a city, evade justice, and yet remain profoundly human in his limitations and vulnerabilities. In the end, understanding the life of Whitey Bulger requires holding both perspectives in tension, recognizing the elements of myth that have captured the imagination while confronting the stark realities that his legend often conceals. Only then can his story be fully understood, not as a tale of unbridled genius or cinematic audacity, but as a complex interplay of fear, power, systemic failure, and human consequence that shaped an entire city for decades. The city of Boston, long shaped by the presence of James Whitey Bulger, experienced profound shifts in the years following his disappearance, arrest, and eventual death. Neighborhoods that had once operated under the silent weight of fear began to breathe differently, yet the legacy of his control lingered in subtle, enduring ways. South Boston, the area most associated with his rise, remained a place of tightly knit communities, but the absence of his shadow allowed for changes that had once seemed impossible. The streets themselves told a story of transformation. Businesses that had previously paid protection money were able to operate with greater independence, reinvesting resources that had once been siphoned into criminal hands. Shopkeepers and residents navigated a renewed sense of agency, though old habits of caution lingered. Even as fear faded, it left an imprint, a quiet awareness that safety and autonomy had once depended on compliance with invisible rules. Law enforcement institutions also felt the ripple effects of Bulger's removal from the equation. The FBI, in particular, faced a reckoning over its decades-long entanglement with him. Internal reviews, congressional hearings, and investigative reporting examined how a single informant could have such influence without accountability. Policies were revised, oversight mechanisms strengthened, and procedures adjusted to prevent similar situations in the future. While these reforms could not erase past harms, they reshaped the culture of law enforcement and reinforced the necessity of transparency and ethical rigor. The broader criminal landscape also shifted. The Winter Hill Gang, long under Bulger's control, fractured in the absence of his leadership. Rival groups attempted to assert influence, but none could replicate the combination of fear, strategic calculation, and institutional protection that he had wielded. The balance of power became more fluid, creating space for local authorities to reclaim some measure of order. Yet the scars of his reign were evident, territories remained defined by past alliances, and the memory of violence continued to shape behavior. Community dynamics were equally affected. Residents, many of whom had lived under the implicit threat of retaliation, gradually adjusted to the new reality. Neighborhood organizations, once careful to avoid conflict with Bulger's influence, began to engage more openly in civic planning, advocacy, and local development. Public spaces that had been marked by caution became arenas for gathering and dialogue. Trust, long fractured by the presence of fear, slowly began to rebuild. Cultural memory in Boston reflected both fascination and caution. Whitey Bulger's story became a reference point for discussions about power, corruption, and morality. Schools, universities, and public forums used his life as a case study in law, ethics, and urban sociology. Documentaries and books examined not only his actions, but the systemic failures that had allowed him to thrive. His name remained present in public consciousness, a reminder of both human ingenuity and institutional vulnerability. The city's political landscape was also influenced by the aftermath. Local leaders, aware of the historical weight of Bulger's influence, approached governance with heightened attention to accountability. Policies were re-evaluated, public trust emphasized, and transparency became a priority. The relationship between municipal authorities and law enforcement underwent subtle but meaningful change, reflecting lessons learned from decades of compromised oversight. For families of victims, Boston's transformation carried complex emotions. Relief mingled with enduring grief. The city's shift did not restore lost lives, but it allowed for the recognition of absence and the acknowledgement of past suffering. Memorials, commemorations, and public discourse provided spaces for reflection. Communities began to articulate stories that had once been suppressed, contributing to a collective reckoning. Economically, areas previously constrained by criminal influence experienced modest revitalization. Business owners could operate without fear of arbitrary demands, and new investment, however cautious, became possible. The normalization of commerce, while uneven, signaled the potential for long-term community renewal. Social networks, too, began to adjust. Relationships that had been maintained out of necessity or fear could now evolve under more ordinary terms. Yet the psychological imprint of Bulger's reign remained. Decades of fear and intimidation do not disappear quickly. Older residents carried memories of threats, disappearances, and coercion. Younger generations grew up hearing stories that were at once cautionary and mythologized. This intergenerational awareness shaped attitudes toward authority, loyalty, and community engagement. It also reinforced the importance of institutional oversight and transparency. Public perception of Boston evolved alongside these changes. The city, once framed by media as a stronghold of organized crime, gradually reclaimed a more nuanced identity. Neighborhoods were no longer defined primarily by the presence of fear, but by resilience, community cohesion, and historical memory. The narrative shifted from one of domination to one of adaptation and recovery. Legal and cultural scholars examined the broader implications of Bulger's life and influence. His story became a lens through which to analyze systemic failure, the ethical complexities of informant relationships, and the interplay between local culture and organized crime. This analysis reinforced the idea that while individuals shape events, institutions and communities also play a critical role in enabling or constraining behavior. In the city's collective consciousness, Bulger became both cautionary tale and historical artifact. His reign was remembered for its impact, its audacity, and its consequences. Yet the city moved forward, integrating lessons from his life into a framework for governance, law enforcement, and community engagement. South Boston, once overshadowed by fear, began to emerge as a neighborhood capable of self-definition beyond the presence of a single individual. Ultimately, Boston's post-Bulger evolution illustrates the interplay between individual power and communal resilience. The absence of his control allowed systems, institutions, and communities to reassert themselves. Change was gradual, uneven, and ongoing, reflecting the enduring complexity of a city shaped by both fear and survival. Whitey's influence remained part of the landscape, not as active force, but as a historical shadow whose lessons continue to shape governance, law enforcement, and community life. The city's adaptation demonstrates that recovery from the impact of prolonged criminal dominance is possible, yet incomplete. Structural reforms, economic renewal, and cultural reckoning coexist with lingering psychological and social effects. In this environment, Boston's story becomes one of transformation, resilience, and the slow reclamation of civic space, where lessons from the past inform the pursuit of a more transparent and accountable future. Whitey Bulger's life, criminal career, and eventual downfall leave behind a legacy that is both complex and sobering, a story that lingers long after his death and the closure of formal legal proceedings. Reflecting on this legacy requires confronting the intricate web of fear, power, and institutional failure that defined his existence, while also considering the broader lessons that his story imparts for society, law enforcement, and the human imagination. It is a legacy defined not only by the crimes he committed but by the system that allowed him to flourish, and by the lives irrevocably altered in his wake. Bulger's influence reshaped Boston for decades, altering neighborhoods, institutions, and the perception of authority itself. South Boston, his home turf and the epicenter of his operations, operated for years under the shadow of his control. Fear was the invisible framework that dictated behavior. Shopkeepers complied without question. Rivals avoided confrontation. Ordinary residents walked familiar streets with a quiet vigilance, understanding that the consequences of misstep could extend far beyond personal injury. The control he exercised was subtle, operating through implication, reputation, and the selective application of violence. Unlike overt tyranny, it was a power that embedded itself into the rhythm of daily life, shaping not just actions but thought processes and expectations. Even after his disappearance and arrest, the imprint of that control lingered, manifesting in cautious behaviors and the whispered recounting of old stories. Institutions, particularly law enforcement agencies, were equally impacted by Bulger's life and actions. The FBI's long-standing alliance with him as an informant revealed profound vulnerabilities in the oversight and ethical management of informants. What had been intended as a tool to weaken rival criminal organizations became a mechanism that allowed one man to operate with near impunity. The failures exposed by Bulger's case prompted widespread reflection and reform. Policies regarding informant management, interdepartmental communication, and accountability were re-evaluated. Internal reviews highlighted the consequences of prioritizing expediency over justice, and subsequent reforms aimed to prevent repetition. These institutional lessons form a crucial part of his legacy, emphasizing how individual actions intersect with systemic weaknesses and the importance of robust oversight in preventing the exploitation of authority. The human toll of Bulger's reign is perhaps the most profound element of his legacy. Victims' families endured decades of uncertainty, grief, and fear, often without closure. Lives were destroyed, communities traumatized, and a pervasive sense of insecurity took hold. The quiet erasure of justice through manipulated law enforcement protections exacerbated this harm. The psychological and emotional consequences endured long after bodies were found or cases resolved, leaving a scar that extended through generations. This legacy of suffering reminds us that the consequences of unchecked power are not merely legal or institutional, they are deeply human, touching the most intimate aspects of life, safety, trust, and familial bonds. Bulger's story also carries a cultural and symbolic resonance. Over time, his life became a touchstone for discussions of organized crime, corruption, and moral ambiguity. Books, documentaries, and films have explored the narrative, often balancing fascination with horror, myth with fact. He is alternately portrayed as a criminal mastermind, a shadowy antihero, and a cautionary figure illustrating the dangers of collusion between crime and authority. These portrayals shape public understanding, influencing how people conceptualize the intersection of power, fear, and systemic failure. While such cultural depictions can risk romanticizing or simplifying reality, they also ensure that the story remains relevant, prompting reflection on societal vulnerabilities and human behavior. The duality of Bulger's life, his simultaneous navigation of criminal networks and institutional alliances, illustrates broader truths about power. Influence is rarely absolute, and survival often depends on understanding the structures around one. Bulger manipulated the channels of law enforcement and organized crime alike, demonstrating the ways that human systems can be both rigid and malleable. His ability to exploit gaps, leverage relationships, and anticipate consequences underscores a form of intelligence that, while morally reprehensible, offers insight into the mechanics of authority and control. Moreover, his life provides lessons in vigilance, ethical responsibility, and the importance of accountability. Institutions tasked with protecting citizens must balance pragmatism with principle. The failures surrounding Bulger's informant status remind us that short-term tactical gains can yield long-term harm if not rigorously monitored. Systems must resist complacency, maintain transparency, and prioritize the protection of communities over convenience or expediency.